Welcome to the course on effective learning for professional development. The basic idea behind going through this course is to learn how to learn. The idea is to tell you that while we learn, what are the processes that we go through, and if we understand those processes, definitely it will help us understand how we learn. So, with this basic introduction, let me tell you what are those points that we are going to cover. First of all, I will tell you how we process information when we learn something, and this process of information processing is also called in a holistic manner cognition. By cognition, we believe that how we register information, how we process information, and how we retrieve information. So, it is important for all of us to understand what is cognitive science. And through this module, I will tell you first how information is acquired, that is, how information is registered through sensation and perception, and how we attend to an information, which is how do we focus on information. And then finally, I will tell you how the information is stored and modified, because if we fail to store this information into our system, then we have to learn every time. Therefore, it is very important for all of us to understand how they are stored and modified. So, these four concepts we will be covering one at a time. First, I will tell you what is cognitive science. Now, cognitive science is a very interdisciplinary science or study of mind and the process. By interdisciplinary science, we mean when we actually take help of different disciplines in order to understand a particular domain of study. And we not only share the findings of different disciplines, we also try to adhere to the methodologies available in different sciences in order to accumulate more and more information about this science, which we call as cognitive science. And toward that end, we actually talk about psychological science, which is part of the behavioral science, philosophy of mind, linguistics, anthropology, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. All these intelligence related or psychology related, philosophy of mind, linguistic, anthropology, and neuroscientific related information are actually accumulated in cognitive science. So, through this science we will know how information is acquired, how information is represented, how it is stored, how it is processed, transferred, and retrieved in a living system. So, with this input, I will first tell you how knowledge is acquired. Now, knowledge is acquired through internal representation. Now, most of us believe that what we see with our eyes, ears, and other sense organs, probably we get it as it is. We do not get it as it is, because after we sense all this information from outside world or also from inside world, it goes through a change, and that change is called representation. And that representation undergoes transformation, because every time we see an object, that gets added to our already available experience, and then it actually transforms. So, the transformation takes place in the second level, and this transformation is not taking place anywhere other than the brain. So, brain actually is the center where such information is transformed, and finally, if that transformation is understood, we can actually understand it, or we can actually simulate it in computational terms, which we call as artificial intelligence or computational intelligence. So, knowledge is acquired not only through our sense organs, it gets represented, that representation gets transformation, the transformation takes place at the higher centers of the brain, and if needed, such higher centers of the brain or the functions can be simulated in computational terms. Now, we will try to understand therefore a little bit about what do we mean by human brain, because this whole process of transformation, representation takes place and representation takes place in the brain. Now, brain is something which is a very energy efficient device. It has just 20 watts of power and it has got trillions of synaptic connections. Over 1.5 billion of neurons are there in the brain, and the connectivity is estimated is close to 3 trillion. How this synaptic connection takes place while we learn is still a very mystery, but at the basic level we understand that all such information are stored in the brain, and the brain has a very special capacity which in computational term we cannot simulate, is that brain can understand the context also in which the information is acquired. So, the context, the content and the intent of the learner when they get into in one particular module, we start learning in a very human way. Although AI, the artificial intelligence does not learn in the same way, because artificial learning takes place on the basis of information only, not on the basis of context and nor with the help of the intent. Therefore, human learning has a very special component which we call understanding. When we understand, we do not de-understand, but if we learn, we can still unlearn, we can still forget. It requires reinforcement. So, during learning process, we have to make sure that we understand what we have been trying to learn. But one more input I would like to give you, that when we learn something, everything we do not learn through our conscious input. There are several unconscious or subconscious input also comes to our mind, which helps us this representation, transformation, and finally getting a learning material stored into our brain system. But the brain is, as I said, is a very complex system. We particularly believe that the brain works in a certain manner. We still do not know how it works, because the brain does not think the way we think it does. Brain has a very special way of thinking. So, it is very important for us to understand what is the process through which this learning takes place, and if we learn it effectively, probably we can also control our learning system in a much better manner. So, in the next slide, I will tell you the cognitive architecture of the brain. That is, when a particular input is entered into our brain, how it is represented, how it is transformed, and then how it is retrieved through our process of memory and learning. Now, this entire architecture of knowledge comes through several stages, and the stages I have written in front of you. It has got several stages, for example, sensation, perception, attention, memory, learning, thinking, intelligence, module, and last, which is the metacognition, is something which we are going to discuss in 2 consecutive modules. In the first module, we will try to understand sensation, perception, attention, and memory, and then in the next module we will try to understand learning, thinking, intelligence, and metacognition. Emotion is a component we will learn sometime later, and of course we will tell you how it actually coexists with our learning system. So, sensation is something, is a stage, is a very basic and a preliminary stage where our sense organs like our eyes, our ears, skin, nose, these sense organs accept energy. and after we accept the energy, we actually try to interpret it, which is called perception. We do not actually interpret all energy that we see in and around us. This energy that is interpreted in the form of perception also is guided by our attention, because we do not attend to everything. Thousands of input we actually attend at one go, and when we attend, we understand that the brain does not have the capacity to process all such information. So, only few input per second we try to attend, and these inputs at best may be 40, 45, but not more than that. But in effect, we actually see hundreds and thousands of different stimuli at one go. We do not attend to everything, and when we attend to certain things, that matter gets stored, which we call memory. So, from sensation to perception to attention to memory, the attended matter is actually stored, and if it is not stored, we have to learn every time. Therefore, when the stored memory is there into our system, it helps us learn. But learning also depends on our ability to think and solve problems. So, thinking and problem solving is a very important part of our learning, which helps us solve problems. And problem solving also depends upon the speed, that is, it depends on our intelligence, and intelligence coexists with our emotion, because as I said, the context plays a role in human learning, the content plays a role in human learning, and the intent plays a role in human learning. So, if I am not intending to learn, probably that learning does not stay with us into our system. Although we will not talk about emotion into our cognitive system, but it has got a very important role. And finally, in the same domain, we will talk about metacognition, that is cognition of our own cognition, how we think about our own thinking. So, with this note, we will first start with sensation and perception. Let us try to understand what do we mean by sensation and perception. Now, sensation, as I said, is a physical energy which is converted into neural signals. That is, if I see something, it is an electromagnetic energy which enters into our eye, and through action potential into our brain through neurons, it actually reaches to our visual system in the brain. There it is represented, transformed, and then we see what we are actually looking into. So, when physical energy is converted into neural signals, it is called sensation. Now, these signals, as I just said, are selected, organized and interpreted at the brain level. Through these, we actually construct our internal representation of the environment. As I said in cognitive system, that after we accept an energy, it undergoes some kind of representation, and that representation actually is done at the level of perception in the environment. So, we will now understand that what kind of input we get it from outside. So, to function effectively, our mind needs both this information through sensation and perception in quantitative terms and qualitative terms. So, when we see something, the stimulus intensity is coded in the brain, that how many times the neurons are getting the fire from outside. That is, when the energy is coming, electromagnetic energy is coming to my brain, the frequency with which I am seeing it, the higher the frequency, higher the intensity. So, in quantitative terms, the brain requires information in frequency, which can be measured in quantitative terms. But the brain also gets certain qualitative input, and this qualitative input is that although we are getting a large number of input from outside, they are patterned in the brain, and the patterns of firing, neural firing, helps us understand that the two stimuli are different. So, In sensation and perception, we basically try to understand what kind of information we are getting in terms of frequency in quantitative terms, and in qualitative terms we try to understand how the two stimuli are different and in which way they are represented in the brain. So, if you remember what we have just spoken in cognitive architecture of the brain, after the sensation, which is acceptance of the energy, and perception, which is interpretation of the energy, it is time for attention to catch hold of it, because through attention, in the next slide I will tell you what really happens to us. So, attention is a cognitive process in which we selectively look into certain objects. So, in a second, if we get thousands of input, we will not be able to attend to everything. We generally attend to 30 to 40 input at one go. Our brain cannot do anything more than that. So, it is a process through which we understand the discrete aspect of the information. We ignore all other information. As I said, 30 to 40 input, if we are paying attention, we are actually ignoring all other information. And through this process, we try to focus on a particular aspect of the information. Now, our attention could be four types. It can be a sustained attention, it can be a selective attention, it can be an alternating attention, it can be a divided attention. Now, if it is a sustained attention, the focus is on a specific task for a longer period. I am trying to focus on a particular task for a longer period, which we will call as sustained attention. But when we talk about selective attention, the focus is on one activity during many. That is, I will focus on one. It is not about the temporality, that is sustained attention, how long we are looking it at. I am looking at in what activity out of many activities in my environment, which we call selective attention. And then comes alternating attention, where I can alternate back and forth between the task. Suppose I have been doing task A, then I can switch to task B, to task C, then once again come back to task B or task A, and if I can back and forth to do this alternatively, is called alternating attention. And finally, there is divided attention, where completely we complete two or more tasks simultaneously. That is, just not attending at alternating rate, we are completing two or more tasks simultaneously, not sequentially, because in back and forth task alternating attention, the information is processed in a sequential manner, but in divided attention actually it is simultaneously done, two tasks done at one go. So, the Broadbent's filter model of attention is a very important model, where we understand that whenever there is a sensory input, the input goes through the filter, through filter we go to the detector, and from detector, if we detect it, it retains into our system. So, it is a filter model of attention, that how we filter information from outside to take into our system in order to represent it, and then in order to allow it to go for transformation. Now, there are several strategies to do attention. I will talk about those strategies to you, and let us try to understand those strategies. The strategies are that you have to, if you have to with sustain attention, you have to declutter the workspace, because alternating attention is a very difficult process. If so many input are actually simultaneously affecting your system or sense organ, you would not be able to actually sustain your attention over a period of time. So, sustenance is not possible, or selective attention would not be possible if you do not declutter it. And then you have to prioritize your task and set very specific goals. And if you do not prioritize it, suppose you have to have 3 or 4 tasks at one go. If we try to put attention to everything at one go, it will hang our system. Instead, if we look for some specific task, specific goal, then our attention becomes much better. And then the timing is a very important part. Now, we know that if we try to read or try to learn over a period of time without break, which we call continuous learning, it does not help our system to consolidate the learned material. It is always advisable that whenever you reach up to a particular level, that is half an hour or 25 minutes, it is always better to give 5-minute break, because the brain gets time to consolidate the information. Otherwise, all such information will retain into your system as a temporary file. And if you do not allow that 5-minute break, then it does not get consolidated. So, consolidation is a very important process in our learning. Let us try to learn how we can consolidate it better. And then we have to cultivate an attitude of non-judgment. Many of us who try to learn a particular portion of the book or a chapter of a book, we try to understand whether we could really memorize or not. Now, while we learn, let us not be very judgmental. If we try to judge yourself whether you have learnt it properly or not every time, you are actually detracting yourself from your attentional field. There is no point in doing that, because learning is a process, and during that process you should be able to learn it through a particular mechanism where your judgment about whether you have done it correctly or incorrectly is not really very helpful. So, when you learn, be fully present into it and be mindful to it. If you are not mindful, not fully present in what you have been actually presenting, it does not help you at all. So, it is important for us to understand, if you switch your attention, that is, in order to sustain attention, as I said, selective attention and divided attention. Divided attention, if you look at the figure, divided attention does not help actually. A lot of people can do divided attention, but they must be able to take up those work in a habitual form, and if it is part of their habit, they do not have to invest much energy in order to do 2 jobs at one go. But if you have to learn something new, it is always better to have selective attention while you actually learn. So, I will tell you that if you try to learn certain things while doing so many other things simultaneously, what will happen to you? Let us try to see. Now, if you switch attention, it will carry a cost. That is, digital distraction, for example, social media, email check, all these things will keep coming to us. I mean, most of us, while we learn, we try to understand whether somebody is calling you or not, whether somebody is sending any message alert or not, whether there is an email or not. If such kind of digital distractions come to you like a mobile phone, it actually takes away from your selective attention to some other inputs. It is not fair. Multitasking is also not a good idea, as I said, divided attention. If you try to do too many things at one go, ultimately you would be able to do one thing only at a time. And if you juggle multiple tasks at one task, you may engage yourself in the whole process, but possibly you would not be able to learn one at a time or one perfect learning material done in a proper way. Interruptions like phone calls, meetings, all these things do not help at all. Mental distraction, worries. Many of us have some kind of worry that if I am reading it right now, trying to learn something, whether I would be able to reproduce it properly or not. So, it is just not about failure to reproduce what you have learned, it is about the fear of failure to reproduce what you have learned. That produces stress, and if you have got anxiety, depression, stress, personal issues, relationship issues, all these things will create mental distractions for you. And sometimes physical discomfort also creates trouble for you. That is why having a very good lifestyle and a very good coping style is very important. Physical discomfort like a cluttered workspace, your table is not organized, you are actually trying to work or learn something in a very noisy environment, are not actually a very comfortable situation. So, by mental destruction I say if you learn, have a very good coping style. Coping style means you should be able to cope with the environment properly, and by physical discomfort I mean you should have a good lifestyle or a reading habit through which you should be able to actually learn without having any kind of physical discomfort. Memory is also thing, it's the faculty of the brain by which we actually understand, we actually encode, store or retrieve data when it is needed. There is a model for memory, this is called multi-store model of memory, in which after we actually accept a energy through sensation and perception, it goes to our short term store, and through that short term store if we reinforce that store, that is if we actually rehearse it, it will be transferred into long term, and if it goes to the long term store we can easily retrieve it. But if we don't rehearse it, it actually the information gets lost. So, from sensory store to short term memory to long term memory, what is required is consolidation, and this memory has of many types. We have got sensory memory which remains with us for less than a second, for millisecond actually. We have short term memory which is also called executive memory, which is less than a minute, and which is long term memory, which is a lifetime memory. Now, this long term memory has got two components, some are explicit memory, some are implicit memory. The explicit memory is a conscious memory and the implicit memory is the unconscious memory. When it is an explicit memory, it is also called declarative memory, that is it can be an episodic memory, you remember certain episode, certain incidents, certain experience, certain event, or it can be a semantic memory, certain concepts like a mathematical concept, like a fact, a poem, these are called declarative memory. When it is called implicit memory, we call it procedural memory, certain skills which we will never forget. For example, when you learn cycling, you would never forget it. Once you learn it, 50 years down the line you will not forget it. If you learn swimming, is a procedural memory, you will not forget it in 50 years possibly, and these learnings do not require rehearsal once you have accumulated such kind of skill. So, with this note, we will take you to the final sessions of this module, that if you have to improve memory, get enough sleep. Sleep will help you in consolidation. Exercise to develop new brain cells and connections. If you exercise mentally and physically, new brain cells, connectivities, networks will come up in order to facilitate your learning. Keep your brain active. Puzzles to choreography, everything can help you. This will increase the vascularity or the blood supply in the brain, and new connectivities will come. Drink enough water, hydration and oxygenation is very important, and spread out your study session, because distributed learning is always much better than continuous learning. So, I have suggested some of the books for you. You can go through and understand how sensation, perception, attention and memory takes place. Thank you so much.